Welcome students to Lesson 5 of the Urban World topic. In this, Lesson 2 on our NEE Urban Area case study, we're going to be exploring this important question. Why does Rio de Janeiro matter in the world and to Brazil? Please take a moment to write the date, title and learning objective and have a pen and paper ready to learn. Time to review prior learning. Please write 1 to 10. Answer the questions from memory, and then mark your answers. Game time. Number 1. Rio, Brasilia and Sao Paulo form Brazil's economic triangle. 2. Brazil was originally a colony of Portugal. 3. Rio's south and central zones form the Old City, originally used as a port to trade commodities. 4. Inland, poor settlements in Rio, called favelas, grew due to rapid population growth. 5. Most of Rio's economically important industrial areas are in the north. 6. The richest neighborhood in Rio is called Barra da Tijuca. 7. Urbanization is generally slowest in HICs. 8. Reasons people move from rural areas are called push factors. 9. The UK has a post-industrial economy, which means manufacturing has largely been replaced by services. 10. Due to the common language, trade with former British colonies is, on average, 20% cheaper than with other countries with different languages. For example, because you don't need to translate any of the contracts or the deals, which costs money to pay the people. Give yourselves a mark out of 10. If you got 8 or more, fantastic. Any questions that you got wrong, test yourselves again on them in a week's time. To introduce this lesson on Rio's importance, I'm going to show you a photo and then some questions are going to come up. Answer the questions using your understanding. Okay, number 1. What makes Rio popular with tourists? Well, using this photo, I'm sure many of you who are doing this lesson recognize this particular landmark. This is called Christ the Redeemer, and it's one of Rio's most famous features. Brazil is an intensely religious Christian country, and the Christ the Redeemer statue symbolizes that. Many people come every year from around the world to visit this place. Landmarks like this, both human and natural or physical, attract tourists to Rio more than to any other city in Brazil, which lack such landmarks and features. So, what major cultural events have happened in Rio recently? Well, you could have talked about 2 specific events. Number 1, the World Cup in 2014, and number 2, the Olympics in Rio de Janeiro in 2016. Many other smaller events have happened there, but those are the 2 main ones in the last 10 years. 3. What other economic sectors may contribute to Rio's economy, aside from tourism? Well, you could have talked about industry, so secondary sector, manufacturing, not just of cars, but also of steel and clothing, other things like that. You may have talked about the quaternary sector. There is a small but growing research sector in Rio de Janeiro. And finally, you may have talked about the informal economy, about people who make money not through formal jobs, but rather through jobs that aren't taxed or have no official contract, where you pay by cash, for example, car cleaners or rubbish collectors in some cases, or street vendors. A vendor is someone who sells things. 4. How might Rio's economic success affect the population distribution of Brazil? This is an important question. Areas of a country that are economically successful, so have lots of jobs with high incomes and are producing and gaining lots of money, attract people. In the UK, London is the most economically successful place, and consequently people from around the UK migrate to London. In the USA, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, very economically important, people migrate there. In Japan, Tokyo, very economically important. In China, Shanghai. You see the pattern. Rio's economic success leads to migration from around Brazil to it. So, in this lesson we're going to find the answers to 3 crucial questions about Rio. Firstly, why specifically Rio? Why has it grown? And second question, why is it important? And finally, how important really is it? So, why has Rio de Janeiro grown? The key reason why Rio has grown is rural to urban migration. More than 70% of Rio's population growth in the last 70 years has been from rural-urban migration. And that is the same with almost every NEE city around the world. So let's remind ourselves why that might be. Here's our map of Brazil, and here's Rio de Janeiro again. In the southwest of Brazil, an area called the Pantanal, and just south below that, there is a very large area of fertile, agriculturally productive land, which means farming is very successful within this area. In the last 70 years, however, farming has changed in Brazil. What used to be farming by manual labor requiring many people to work the land for plowing and planting crops and raising livestock has changed as a result of mechanization. Because Brazil has developed, it's able to purchase, maintain, and use mechanized farming techniques such as tractors. This significantly reduced the amount of people needed to farm land, and it increased crop yields. Consequently, many people in rural areas in the southwest of Brazil and south of Brazil who would have been employed no longer had jobs because they weren't needed, and so they moved to Rio de Janeiro. A large number of these manual laborers were low-skilled and lacking education. Consequently, they moved into the favelas. Additionally, in the north of Rio, in the northeast in particular, there is a large area of semi-arid land called, in Portuguese, sertão, S-E-R-T-A-O, which means semi-arid dry land, this whole area here. And this often suffers from drought. So it has the opposite problem to the south. Here, the land is unproductive, it's difficult to farm, it's difficult to make an income. That's a significant push factor. Because of these two forces, mechanization and drought in other parts of Brazil, the rural population of Brazil has declined as people have migrated to cities like Rio de Janeiro. And this has led to Rio's dramatic population growth. Between 1950 and into the future to 2030, you see a significant and rapid population growth in Rio. In 1950, fewer than 4 million people lived in Rio. By 2000, it was almost 12 million. Today, in 2020, it's more than 13 million people live in Rio de Janeiro, making it a mega city. In particular, between 1950 and 1980, the most rapid period of population growth, this was when the government did not control migration effectively, and it led to people arriving in the city of Rio too fast for the government to build adequate housing. Consequently, favelas grew rapidly. But this is the story of Rio's population growth, and why it has an old and a new city, and why the new city is populated by low-income favelas, as rural workers in Brazil have moved to the city in search of a better life. So why is Rio important? Those people who are in rural Brazil and those people who are in Europe who migrated to Rio clearly thought of something about it that made it important. Rio de Janeiro is one of the richest cities in Brazil and in South America, and here's why. The primary sector in Rio de Janeiro, unlike many cities, is very important. Most of the primary sector doesn't actually happen in Rio, but the companies have their headquarters there. The oil and gas industry in Brazil is very important. Off of the coast of Brazil, the east coast, are oil and natural gas fields. Those are storages of oil and gas locked underneath the seabed underground. And Brazil's largest energy company, owned by the government, called Petrobras, is responsible for extracting the oil and gas and exporting it around the world. And Petrobras's headquarters are located in Rio de Janeiro, in the central zone. As a result of major companies like Petrobras, more than 3,000 people within Rio and more than 15,000 overall across Brazil have jobs in the primary sector. Those jobs that Petrobras offers to people within Rio are very often high-paid jobs requiring high skills. They're in the headquarters. And this company pays an enormous amount of tax to Brazil's government, contributing to Rio's economy. That's the primary sector. However, the Brazilian government has used many of these taxes that it has gained from big companies like Petrobras to invest in its secondary sector. As education and skills have improved, and as it has imported and acquired new technologies like machinery and factory technologies, it has been able to invest in manufacturing. Consequently, in 2019, Brazil's export economy looked like this, and this is a focus on Rio's export economy. You can see it's a highly diversified economy, meaning that many different types of products are exported, not just primary products, for example. Rio de Janeiro is an important center of Brazil's aerospace industry, making aircraft. A big Brazilian company called Embraer makes aircraft, commercial aircraft, which you may have flown on, that are sold around the world. And if you think about the multiplier effect, you'll see why the rubber tires are important. As car companies like Land Rover manufacture their goods in Rio, so tire companies grow. So do valve companies, which are important in, for example, mining and shipping. And a whole other range of manufactured goods have grown in Rio de Janeiro because of Brazil's investment in this sector and because of the multiplier effect. As a result of the primary and secondary sector, Brazil has been able to invest more in education and in upskilling its people. Consequently, the tertiary sector has grown in two important ways. This is the biggest shopping centre in Rio de Janeiro. It's called Shopping Centre Leblon, and it is very expensive, very high class, something that wouldn't look out of place in New York or in London or in Tokyo in Japan. The elite, rich people in Rio de Janeiro visit this shopping centre and buy all kinds of expensive clothes and other products there. This kind of place provides jobs not only to the people who work there, but also to the companies that sell their goods there. And it shows how the people in Rio de Janeiro are becoming richer because they can afford the goods that are sold in a shopping centre like this. That's part of the tertiary sector that's growing. But finally, if you want to set up a company, not only in Brazil but anywhere, you need money. And when you start that company, you often don't have money. It's the same in Brazil. So how do you get it? Well, you get a loan from a bank. And that's where Rio's finance sector comes in. Finance based on banks. One of Brazil's biggest banks operates in Rio de Janeiro, and it loans money to businesses and people wanting to start businesses in Rio de Janeiro, allowing them to invest in, for example, the equipment or the factory or the office space to be able to start their business and become successful. So the economy is based on these three sectors. As a result of all these three sectors working together, Rio de Janeiro's economy is now worth $310 billion every year. That means the total amount of money made by all the people in the city every year is $310 billion. Making it the second richest city in Brazil after Sao Paulo, and one of the richest cities in all of South America. However, none of these reasons are why Rio de Janeiro is famous. Rio's economy is famous because of tourism, and that's what makes Rio so interesting to study. Sao Paulo is richer, Sao Paulo is bigger, but it's nowhere near as famous. Because of tourism in Rio, it is. Why? The Copacabana beach, often held up as the most beautiful, most impressive city beach in the world, attracts more tourists than any other beach in South America and is one of the most popular tourist beaches in the world. It featured in the Rio Olympics for the volleyball, for example, but it was famous long before then. Brazil's and Rio de Janeiro's beaches create an important economic activity for Rio de Janeiro. Hotels line the beach along with restaurants and other services to tourists. That's not all though. There are landmarks in Rio that are famous. Not only human ones like Christ the Redeemer, but in the background, in front of him, you can see Sugarloaf Mountain. These natural and human features have attracted people for more than 50 years to Rio de Janeiro, making it more famous than Sao Paulo, which is mostly flat land without any impressive physical or human features. It's often said about Sao Paulo, you have no idea where you are because it all looks the same. That's definitely not the case in Rio. What is the biggest party in the world? Well, it's often said that the biggest party in the world is Rio de Janeiro's Carnival. More than 1 million people go there every year. The streets packed with people in all kinds of dress from all around the world, helping to share culture, not only the black African culture of former slaves, but also European culture and North American culture, mixing together. It is one of Brazil's most famous cultural events, and it's really important for helping to explain why Rio is so famous. At the opening ceremony of Rio de Janeiro's Olympics, this kind of party was the main event. At the closing ceremony of London's Olympics in 2012, when Rio was introduced, this was the opening event. And all these designs were showed off, because that's what makes Brazil and Rio famous. And finally, and more recently, because of the education in Rio and because of its economic success, there's enough money to invest in infrastructure and in demand for people with high incomes. Consequently, you have buildings like this. Only in cities and places where people have high incomes do you have museums like this, because people can't afford the art or the tickets in poorer countries. They can't afford to build such a construction in a poorer country. They have to spend the money on education and healthcare. The Niterói Museum in Rio de Janeiro is a famous landmark, and another reason why Rio de Janeiro is an important city. So tourism and the primary and secondary and tertiary sectors have made Rio important not only economically, but also culturally and in terms of its fame worldwide. Time to assess learning. Question 1. What has led to the rise of industry in Rio de Janeiro? Well, you could have said the following things. Firstly, Brazil's investment in industry, because it knows that that leads to higher incomes and it prevents a trade deficit. Trade deficits caused mostly by exporting primary products and importing manufactured products. You may have also said that the increasing education of people in Brazil allows them to start and work in manufacturing companies. And you may have also said that since Brazil is developing and becoming an NEE, the secondary sector is growing. And this is attracting more people who work in secondary industry. Finally, you may have said that since Brazil is becoming more economically successful, TNCs that work in manufacturing from around the world are investing in Brazil and setting up factories there, such as Land Rover, a British company, now owned by an Indian company. Question 2. What physical challenges does Rio de Janeiro face which prevent construction in all areas of the city? Well, you could have said that within the centre of Rio is Tijuca National Park, which, although it's a very impressive physical landmark and has Christ the Redeemer on the top, it prevents building, which means that construction has to happen on limited land in the south, west, and east of it. This also makes house prices more expensive. Question 3. Why do cultural landmarks such as art museums show up more often in HIC and NEE cities than LIC cities? It's because of demand and government investment. If people have low incomes, they have low demand for such cultural landmarks. They spend much more of their money on their basic needs. It's also because the government has less money to invest in such landmarks and such features like art museums. And consequently, In LICs, there are far fewer of them in each city than in HICs. For example, think of London, which has more than 100 museums. Okay, time to embed learning. Please answer the questions using your understanding and then mark your answers. Okay, number 1. You need both of these. Climate and changes in agriculture. Key points. Make sure you have mechanization. Make sure you have semi-arid. Make sure you have northeast. Explain the key points. 2. Outline 2 sectors that create high-paid jobs and explain their success. Why are they successful? So for the first one, primary, you may have used the example of Rio Tinto or Petrobras, but make sure you explain that's because there are many natural resources nearby. Secondary, explain the different types of product and goods that are made by the secondary sector. You could have looked back at the tree map, the export map, and then talk about the multiplier effect. And explain how access to the port makes trade easy and therefore makes the secondary sector successful. 3. One way that Rio's location has contributed to its tourism and culture. So each of these points you need. Make sure you give specific examples. Copacabana Beach, Sugarloaf Mountain, the Carnival. Give yourselves a mark out of 12. If you got 10 or more, fantastic. Make sure, as ever, that you add in green pen any corrections or parts that you missed. That's key for your learning. Okay. From this lesson, write 2 questions. Answer them from memory. And then test yourselves in a week on them. Next lesson, we dive in to the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. This is a challenging life. I want you to find out just how much of a struggle it is and what Brazil and Rio are trying to do about it. Join me then.